Good evening, viewers. Welcome to another episode of the Speakers Gallery. Our guest today is none other than Andrew Franklin. Andrew Franklin is a former Marine Major, U.S. Marines, and he's a security analyst and expert. Andrew, welcome to the show today.
Thank you for having me, Farah.
Andrew, too many things have happened in the last 1 week of global proportions. Sometimes we felt that the death or the assassination of the Major General who commanded the Quds Force. Quds Force is an elite, basically, force in Iran that does all the security things for the Iranian government. And it's not part of the mainstream military, but it's like a militia, but a very well-trained militia.
Right.
But that has experiences in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and literally, it's a Shia militia in a sense.
It is the elite of the Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Absolutely. And he was killed by the Americans.
Yes.
Donald Trump said that he was planning attacks on American assets and Americans themselves. And they promised that there's going to be revenge.
Yes.
A couple of days later, something that has never happened in Kenya happened. Manda Island, military base there, which is the American Navy base, in conjunction with the Kenyan Navy, was attacked. In almost 30 years since the collapse of the center in Somalia and all Al-Shabaab and Islamic courts and Al-Ittihad and all these things, nobody ever targeted an American base. This has just happened now, first on the heels of that. First of all, tell us what, in your opinion, is the implication of the death of Qasem Suleimani, and how that affects us also as Africans, far divorced from them and not at the center of the happenings in there. And what's the connection? What's the link with what happened right now in Kenya?
Well, the short answer to about a link to what happened on Sunday morning when Al-Qaeda attacked a Kenyan Navy base, which is also hosting significant American facilities, security-related facilities, the short answer is there really is no link. And the reason is that Al-Shabaab must have been planning this base attack for months and months. It was a complicated, complex attack. It was not an off-the-shelf kind of attack. That is an operation waiting to just be sprung on somebody if somebody makes a phone call and orders it to be done. It's not a mall attack, for example, in Nairobi, which can in fact be prepared and be sitting on, the plans can sit on a shelf, a Westgate type attack. Even a Dusit 2 attack, which, by the way, we're coming up on the first anniversary of Dusit 2 in about a week and a half. On the other hand, when you ask about the repercussions and consequences of the assassination of General Suleimani, on those of us living in East Africa, there are great potential opportunities for Iran to strike back at the U.S. and Israeli interests within East Africa. Keep in mind, there are two alleged Iranian terrorists who were picked up in 2012, possibly in an Israeli orchestrated sting operation at the Nyali golf course, collecting 15 kilos of plastic explosive. They are still in community prison. In fact, in last year, now it's last year, Happy New Year, earlier in 2019, there were suggestions that the Iranian assistant foreign minister had visited to see about getting them released.
Absolutely.
At the same time as that was being mentioned parenthetically in the media here, not very significantly, it comes out as well that, Iran is one of the major customers for Kenyan tea after Pakistan. But Iran buys a heck of a lot of Kenyan tea, which is why the sanctions, the Trump administration enhanced sanctions on Iran and dollar transfers has such a significant effect on countries like Kenya, because if Iran cannot pay for tea in dollars, well, how does Kenya benefit? By selling its tea to Iran. Now, the notion of the Revolutionary Guard Corps is a parallel military organization to the regular army in Iran. The Quds Force is the elite of the Revolutionary Guard Force, Guard Corps. In 2019, the United States declared the Revolutionary Guard Corps to be a terrorist organization, which is rather phenomenal in scope if you think about declaring another nation's army to be a terrorist organization. And once you declare it under our laws, particularly since 9/11, all manner of things can start falling into place. Restrictions on financial transfers, restrictions on contacts with members of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. But the logic of declaring the Revolutionary Guard Corps a terrorist organization and then subsequently assassinating its essential head, you can see from a legal point of view, a lawful point of view, not a moral point of view, that this is okay, that this makes sense. Now,
that a terrorist head has been taken out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the
well, why can I ask you this question? Why did the Iranians feel it fit, in the first place, to have a parallel guard, a parallel security machinery that is being used for all external engagements that Iran wants to do? For example, they had a big influence in Iraq, in the Iraqi war, civil war, you could say, yes. Or basically the Shia-Sunni divide thing. Yes. They had a similar one also in Lebanon,
yes,
being very close to the Hezbollah, literally put together Hezbollah into another elite force.
Yes.
They are in Syria fighting alongside the national Syrian army, the Syrian army itself, for Assad, and of course the Russians in there. Why is it that they have decided to create a militia, a religious militia, to do the parallel work to the national army itself?
Because well, yes, if you look at the overthrow of the Shah of Iran,
yes,
in 1979, you know, the army was full of royalists, monarchists, the regular army, and it was full of equipment that had been built up by the United States and the British ever since, in fact, from 1953-54, after we and the British orchestrated the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh, who had been democratically elected, but was viewed as being too Soviet, too post-Soviet, or too independent,
too socialist in a sense,
whatever he was. Yes. You know, the Iranian armed forces had been equipped, trained, and of course with all the oil.
Pretty much a creation of the Americans, and Sun has the British and the rest of them.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So no matter who took over in '79, there was a need for an army, and an army that functions.
Under Khomeini.
That's right. Except that if you have an army, a functioning army that's well trained and well equipped, but is not loyal to you because you overthrew essentially their leader. What do? You do set up a separate parallel organization. Many authoritarian states, or dictatorships, if you will, do this sort of thing. In many ways, in the Soviet Union, the KGB had troops. It did have infantry troops as a counterweight to the Soviet army.
The Red Army.
Yes, so in other words, this is not unusual. And as with all bureaucracies and all government agencies, these organizations take on lives of their own. But Al-Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, first of all, being highly motivated and kept separate from the conscripts who basically
are professional military men, basically.
Yes,
we would call them professional soldiers.
But the conscripts, the draftees, who bore much of the brunt of the fighting in the Iran-Iraq War for 8 years, in which I think almost 1 million Iranians died. It was a horrendous time in a war that essentially we turned a blind eye to Saddam Hussein and his use of poison gas and the like. So you know, so we have a lot of questions to answer. But the fact is, keep in mind, Iran does have its genuine national interests within the Middle East, just as all other states do. And you know, it has focused on the Shia populations, which were marginalized historically in many of the countries in the Middle East. But also, we've now seemed to have lost sight in the fact that Iran cooperated with the United States and others in fighting ISIS in Syria. So we have a situation where The consequences.
ISIS and Al-Qaeda before ISIS, yes.
Well, yes, but Al-Qaeda, which was the al-Nusra Front in Syria, which started reporting on the emergence of this so-called Islamic State in Syria as being even more extreme and out of control than they were. The fact is that the Islamic State became the existential threat in Iraq and in Syria, where they carved out a tremendous geographic caliphate until being beaten back, partially with the aid of the Iranians. Now, if you talk though about, okay, but Iran is dead now.
Not the mainstream Iranian military.
No.
But the militia.
Yes, that's
which
true.
Essentially is a Shia militia.
Yes, that's right. Well, and Iran itself is a Shia state.
It's a theocracy, yeah.
Yes, although it has had substantial minorities who have lived in peace pretty much since the Shah was overthrown, including the Jewish minority.
Yeah. They're even in parliament, and I remember when I visited there as
That's right. So, but
as head of a Kenyan parliamental delegation, and I saw the Jewish members of parliament. I saw also the Zoroastrians who were also represented.
Yes, I know.
Sunnis, of course, many Sunnis.
Yes, the only people who who got left out were the people of the Baha'i faith.
Yes.
Were persecuted after Khomeini took power.
But there again, you will never see any Sunni in a high-profile
That's
office.
true. But the bottom line is, this Soleimani is dead. He was assassinated, and the consequences are still unfolding. There are sleeper cells, just as I mentioned the two Iranian so-called agents in committee.
Ever tried to find out exactly what was the intention of the Iranian government in that sting operation that was uncovered, as you put it, with the support of the Israelis?
Yes.
What did they intend to do in Kenya?
Well, it's questionable. It raises a lot of questions because, you see, at the coast, the Israelis and the Iranians were at war. There was an intelligence war in 2010, 2011, and 2012. You may remember that it was the Israelis who uncovered the fact that some 30 Tanzanian-flagged oil tankers registered in Zanzibar were carrying Iranian oil in violation of sanctions. They were that was the oil being exported to India, to even South Korea, North Korea, but the Iranian-flagged vessels could not carry that oil. And in fact, most of the Western states, and because of sanctions against oil sales from Iran. And somehow, the ship's registry in Tanzania, which is actually still in Zanzibar, flagged 30 oil tankers. The Israelis released that information to the United States. There has also been...
It's understandable to see the economic dimensions of it and the sanctions busting.
Now,
busting by the Israelis. Oh, sorry, by the Iranians.
Oh, certainly.
Which, of course, even the Emirates played such a powerful role.
Absolutely.
Because Emirates is
why they were
a lot of money
buying,
from it.
But
why
explosive?
They would want to be part of a criminal, terrorist network in here and buy explosives is what I'm...
Well, I think it was to attack Israeli targets.
In Kenya?
In Kenya. And it's, you know, and this is sort of, now it's lost in the, it's being lost now in the recesses of history. It's 8 years since they were arrested at the golf course.
Why did the government kind of keep a bit hush-hush on this issue?
Well, because there's another...
To an extent whereby even at one stage there was a deal between the two countries and the Iranians wanted to take them back for them to serve the remainder of the time in Iran, which of course is a joke. But why did the government, where is this nexus between Iran, terrorism, Kenya government, and the Israelis in there? What is happening?
Well, I think that there may, in fact, the economic interest of tea. Of course, if Iran says, you know, we're not buying your tea, this is before sanctions, that can influence the government.
Would that be, of course, in trying to get them out, yes, but of course, you have to be conscious of the fact that there was a criminal intent in here. There was a targeting of national targets, national destruction in here, which essentially is a very bad thing in relations between two countries that do have a diplomatic relations.
Well, certainly.
And we did not even see for a moment Kenyan Minister for Foreign Affairs call the Iranian ambassador and basically or ask to recall the Kenyan ambassador from Iran.
Well, Kenya has a very pragmatic foreign policy. It has. I don't mean to be facetious. We're talking about a country that broke relations with Israel, and yet the Israeli interest section, the Israeli interest section was the UNEP delegation, which is where the Israeli embassy is still to this very day. So after 1973-74, when the OAU, the precursor of the African Union, demanded that all countries break relations with Israel because Israeli troops were now occupying part of Africa, having gone across the Suez Canal at the end of the 1973 war. Well, Israel broke relations with, Kenya broke relations with Israel and maintained exceptionally strong ties, particularly in the construction industry.
It's very.
So I would suggest, but if you want to look
very fussy. As somebody who has been a practitioner of politics in this country for close to 30 years now, for about 30 years, there are things that I could not explain. For example, we had the Islamic Party of Kenya, the IPK.
Right, that was banned.
Which got a lot of support from the Iranians.
That's correct.
At the time.
Yes.
And the Shia businessmen in the country were basically the conduit was the Iranian embassy in Dar es Salaam.
That's right.
And Shia businessmen who were never touched by the Kenyan intelligence.
That's right.
So you wonder whether actually IPK was clandestinely a project of the government, the Moi government at the time, because of it's tricky. It's very difficult to understand some of these things. You don't know when a government would be part of what is essentially considered an anathema ordinarily, but they would be there so that you attract the interest.
There are elements that I believe there have been elements in the Kenyan government that have been operating independently of each other for some time. If we look at
and even possibly even operating with the terrorists themselves, because there are other issues there.
That's possibly true. But you see, if you remember
acts of terrorism,
if you remember the assassination of imams from the coast by the ATPU, allegedly by the anti-terror police unit. Allegedly, there were kill lists circulating by the Israeli intelligence services to the anti-terror police unit. And if you look at the Mombasa Republican Council agitation, MRC, which is, after all, a legal organization. It was never banned. But more importantly, when you ask the question, I'm glad you did, about the IPK and Iran's influence, because in the mid to late 1980s, the Saudi influence at the coast started to grow. Not just at the coast, but all the way up the Mombasa Road, where mosques began to appear at every town. Or it was like marching up. That was this Wahhabi influence, which has now also been mentioned as the reason for part of the reason for the collapse of Somalia, of the scientific socialism, the secularism of Siad Barre. That is all the imams who came back from Saudi Arabia and set up schools, madrasas. No, but see, I'm just saying that we look at history only from the point of view as because try to make sense of where we are now and why Iran would have sleeper cells in Kenya, and how can you trace them back? You have mentioned very importantly this political party that was banned, that the Sheikh eventually ran away to Germany.
Largely Sunni Muslims.
Sure.
But again, here was the Iranian government. Perfect relationship with the Kenyan government.
Yes, and
very close to Moi. Moi was very close to the Iranians.
And in conflict
as a counterweight on the difficulties that he was experiencing from the West at that time.
True.
Because after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the narrative changed.
Yes.
It was more of democracy, human rights. You remember Harenbaga and Ambassador. No, Harenbaga was much later, but Smith Hemstone, and all that. Yes, and the restrictions from the IMF, from the World Bank, and the rest. And Kenya went pretty much Iran as a way, probably to say, hey, you push us too hard, we will go the other way, because there was no Soviet Union in those days. Earlier than that, it was you're not too good with the capitalists, the West, then you go to the East. But there was no East at the time.
That's true. But also we're now looking at Iran's national interests in the Middle East versus
how do we still have that relationship. We still have that relationship between Kenya, and I remember very well when the 1998 American embassy attack happened. for the Kenya government, it was like, we told you Americans, you didn't want to listen to us. You tell us open up for democracy and the rest of it. Now, you see what is coming through that? You know, you liberalize the political environment, you liberalize everything. Now, we're faced now with Islamic terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism. So, in a sense, I could see in the speech that was given by Arab Moi that time, there was a glee. It's like, God, of course, we suffered as Kenyans much more than anybody else.
Yes.
But it looks like the government of the day didn't quite care about that.
Yes.
Are we likely to have a similar situation in which the priorities at Washington isn't becoming that clear? And do we have a situation in which, even as the government, as security agencies of Kenya and the rest of them, we would see terrorist acts and terrorism and say, okay, fine, we might as well look the other side, because then the attention is a chance to draw the attention. And you basically have to look at it, because the British were collaborated in the sinking of an American ship to get the Americans into the war. Second World War, I think it was the First World War, one of them. You remember that?
Well, that's the sinking of the Lusitania with many Americans in port. Well, it's hard. There are wheels within wheels and holes.
Absolutely. So, are we likely to see a lot of these things?
No, I think what you're talking about,
because it's too much of a coincidence. I mean, we have Suleimani at the other end, and within a very short period of time, American interests and targets and assets are being destroyed in Manda, which has never happened for all these years. And first on the heels of that, last night in a place called Saredo, which is about 100 kilometers from the border, there was a primary school that was attacked, and 4 young men were killed, and many were injured.
Yes.
And the mosque was destroyed.
Yeah.
This never happened for a very long time. I mean, Al-Shabaab never got that close to doing the kind of things they did, and that deep inside. In Mandera and Wajir at the border, closer to the border, is understandable. But 100 kilometers inside Kenya?
There are permanent Al-Shabaab camps within places in Tana River and elsewhere. They are permanent. They're not. These are not cross-border raiders anymore. And just as
why are we not getting rid of them?
The ineffectiveness of Kenya's security agencies
it's
legend. Has become legend. Has become legend. I don't want to mince any words now. We dance around. We're polite because sometimes it's people we know. But in fact,
it justified our entry into Somalia.
It was used to justify a punitive expedition.
And if you say Kenya is extremely safe now, we've cleaned out Al-Shabaab, flushed out everybody, then you don't have any further justification to stay in Somalia again. So, and we need to be in Somalia because there's a lot of money in it. There are a lot of other interests that are also at stake. There is a number of things that are at play, including the maritime dispute with Somalia and a number of things.
True.
And we really want to get the Americans, the West, and the rest of it to come on our side, which is not that clear-cut now. And so what happens?
What we have in Kenya are opportunities for terrorists. You see, the thing about we have a government and we have a political elite, a political class, that essentially will tell you how you can die in a terrorist attack in London or Paris or Nice or New York City or someplace. And to kind of like explain away why you could die here at Westgate or Dusit, 14 Riverside Drive a year ago. The government here will tell you, well, what about dying in a terrorist activity here and there? So in other words, this is the war on terror. Terrorism is everywhere. But the fact is, when you look at terror attacks in Western Europe or elsewhere, what you also see, or Manchester, for example, at a concert, at a Boston Marathon at the end, but what you see is a different kind of reaction by the security forces. And also, I still have the confidence.
Tendency to...
Lessons learned. Lessons learned. When a large truck is left parked in Nice within the security zone and then driven into a crowd of people on Bastille Day in 2016, I believe. It was a terrorist attack. And 80 people were killed, but 100 and some odd were grievously wounded. I have no doubt that the people in charge of security in Nice were all sacked. We're all told to go home.
It doesn't happen that in Kenya.
And that does not happen here. What we're seeing since Sunday morning in Lamu is we're seeing pictures of bodies. We're not sure who they are necessarily. We're seeing the Kenyan government saying there were no Kenyans killed. in the attack, but somehow 3 Americans were killed and 2 were wounded inside a perimeter that the Kenya Defense Forces is responsible for maintaining. So somehow, Al-Shabaab...
It's unlikely that there was no Kenyan casualties in your opinion.
It's impossible. It's impossible. There are base personnel who would have been sleeping at 5 in the morning and awakened by what apparently were mortar rounds. Apparently Al-Shabaab was shooting mortars, and what's not yet certain is whether a vehicle-borne IED was used to breach the perimeter, the gate, because that would have been driven by a suicide bomber, and that would have been the second suicider since the Dusit attack on the 15th of January 2019.
Given your extensive experience on the security sector itself, more precisely, the kind of insecurity we're experiencing all these years, and somebody thoroughly trained in that, a legal mind too, are we expecting more terrorist attacks in the country in the near future?
Well, we should, not just, yes, in the near future and throughout 2020. Al-Shabaab has basically ramped up its war against the government of Kenya. It's been, for the last 8 years, since we invaded Somalia on October 15th, 2011, there has been essentially a growing, albeit low-intensity conflict throughout Mandera, Wajir, Garissa, Lamu.
Why would they want to push Kenya so hard at this stage when indeed it is become, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Al-Shabaab's main focus is Somalia. They want to get rid of the government, Farmajo's government in there.
Yes.
The government in Somalia and the government in Kenya have not been seeing eye to eye that well. Lately,
yes,
they're no longer reading very much from the same script.
Right.
You were telling me why.
Well, Al-Shabaab has now opened a new front.
We can't get it. Yes, what's the new front?
The new front has started in mainland Lamu. It's a new front of its war in Somalia. But let's remember, a year ago at Dusit, the attackers, the Al-Shabaab attackers, were Kenyans. There were no foreign fighters there. This was not
None of them was actually an ethnic Somali.
No, they were not. And so, in other words, there is a franchise growing in Kenya. An Al-Shabaab franchise. Al-Shabaab is a franchise of Al-Qaeda. But the Kenyan organization now has developed its own identity, its recruitment patterns, and although there are people being sent for training into Somalia, we now have homegrown Kenyans who are not ethnic Somalis. But we have just generalized insecurity because we don't control the border either. Yeah. We've had a nearly 5-year operation supposedly to flush Al-Shabaab out of Boni Forest, which is ongoing. We still have an Italian NGO worker who was kidnapped, abducted.
The lady.
23-year-old, now 24-year-old, Silvia Constanca Romana, who was abducted on the 20th of November 2018 from Chagema Marketplace, or Market Center, in Kilifi. But that's 80 kilometers from the coast. And
from Mombasa?
Well, in Kilifi County, but it's, where there's some 15,000 Italian citizens permanently resident along the coast. But she was taken and then spirited away and is still missing. Now, we also have 2 Cuban doctors who were abducted in April of 2019.
From Mandera?
From Mandera, from outside their residence on the way to work. A policeman was killed, another policeman guard was wounded, and they were taken off and now are, in fact, practicing medicine in Somalia. They are delivering, well, you have to understand, Al-Shabaab in Somalia is administering anywhere between 800,000 and 1 million people. They control, it's referred to as vast swathes of the rural area, but they also, that's true, fair enough, they control, this is not so much ungoverned spaces, it's Al-Shabaab is now governing large areas of rural Somalia, but that's also including market centers, town centers. Everyone talks about how there's an administration of justice in Somalia by Al-Shabaab. Yeah. If you have a dispute, you go to Al-Shabaab, and that's including commercial disputes. In the last 2 months, it's come out that Al-Shabaab is collecting more taxes inside Mogadishu, including from the port, including now from the port. than is the federal government of Somalia. In other words, this is not because people are ideologically happy with al-Shabaab or religiously happy. They are intimidated into supporting, and as most people in the world would like to have a peaceful day and go to sleep and wake up in the morning peacefully, you have to go with the strongest party in your area. You know, it doesn't mean you acquiesce in what's going on.
What are the options? We are more or less on the fear that people have in their hands, or their fingers very close to the buttons. What could possibly the Iranians do to put risk to Americans globally? And what, in your opinion, would be the reaction of America? I mean, Donald Trump was very categorical. He says, we will target everything, including cultural centers, and he figured out 52 targets.
Well, there's many more targets in Iran.
And my assumption is that some of those cultural targets he's talking about is Mashhad and, you know, all these religious places. By the way, I've been to a good number of them. Mm-hmm. I have been to Mashhad, which is, they call it the Haram. Haram means the holy place, basically like what you call the Mecca. Mm-hmm. Mecca. And because the Shias have more or less a parallel to Mecca, where they have Imam Ali Rida, or I don't know, and then of course Najaf is where the grandson of the Prophet himself is buried or killed. I don't know. They have some the beliefs in there, and those are places that are holier to the Shias than even Mecca and Medina, in my opinion. When you look at the way they make the tawaf, which means they go around the grave. And then, of course, they have Qum, which is... So my presumption is that all these holy Shia places, which the Shias hold very close to their hearts. And then, of course, if Donald Trump goes ahead and takes out one or two of those places, you can rest assured every Shia globally would want to die for that cause. Oh. And that, of course, puts on fire the whole country, the whole world, the whole globe. And they're not small in number. You're talking about close to 100 million in Iran. Yes. And a third, or if not more than a third of the population in
Iraq.
Iraq is there more than
40%,
more than 50%,
okay.
About 50%. But then you have them also in Lebanon, you have them in Syria, you have them in literally everywhere.
Minority in
you
Bahrain.
Have a very powerful minority in Kenya,
or in
India,
and in Bahrain.
In Bahrain, of course, they're the majority in Bahrain.
Yes, and they're suppressed by the Sunni
They
monarchy.
are suppressed by the royal family, which is Sunni. Now, what exactly? What's your fear, being an expert in security?
Well, you see
what could the Iranians possibly do now?
Well, Kenya is a very different. It doesn't have as. I don't believe there are as many sleeper cells or as active sleeper cells run by Iran here any longer. Oh. I do believe that what's happened in 2012, 2013, 2014, brutal as it may have been between the Israelis and the anti-terror police unit, did reduce, roll up a lot of the sleeper cells. On the other hand, if we were sitting in West Africa, we'd have a much bigger problem because there are substantial Lebanese diaspora communities in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Nigeria, Ghana, all over. And I first came across them in Sierra Leone when I was there in the 1980s, and I remember
all the Francophone.
Yes, the Francophone, but also Sierra Leone and the gold areas, the diamond areas. This is before the government collapsed under Foday Sanko when I was there.
There are more Lebanese Christians in the rest of the world in the diaspora than you have them in Lebanon.
That's true, and a Lebanese Christian who was subsequently killed by people from Liberia, 6 of them, who were in a place called Seguema on the border with Liberia. Yeah. They had served in the Lebanese army. They had served then in the Phalange, the Christian militia, and they had been invited.
The Maronites, you call them.
They were Maronites, but they're also different. Lebanon is a patchwork of religions and ethnic groups. It's very confusing.
Absolutely.
And that's why they have a president who has to be Christian and a prime minister must be Sunni
Muslim,
and then Hezbollah is a state within a state and is also very much anti-Israel.
And there was a massive celebration when Qassemi was taken out in Lebanon.
Yes.
The Christians and the Sunnis were celebrating his death.
Because they saw it as a blow against Hezbollah. Yeah. And let's not forget, Hezbollah also blew up the Marine Corps barracks. in Lebanon in 1983.
Killed 250,
241 American U.S. servicemen, including 227 of our Marines who were blown up at the airport. Very bad situation. Thing is, though, so in West Africa, there are more buttons to push within these diaspora communities, some of which have actually intermarried with the locals, in truth.
Yeah.
But also have tremendous amount of economic clout. On the other hand, if Israel, for example, has made it very clear that they are not involved with this assassination, they have actually. This is interesting because Israel, we've seen Benjamin Netanyahu as wanted the United States to take out Iran on behalf of Israel. Has been very bellicose, and I think he is correct when he estimates that Iran wants to see Israel destroyed. On the other hand, as we're coming up on the first anniversary,
the Iranians and the Israelis have always had a very close, cozy.
Of course, they had excellent relations under the Shah.
And the ground relationships, and sometimes you get the feeling that all that rhetorics that Ahmadinejad and the rest of them do they do it for a purpose, not because they hate Israel and they would want to see Israel wiped out of the face of the earth, but that kind of a talk always gives a justification to Israel for the world to say, "Oh my God, they want to wipe out the Jews." The way Hitler tried to do that. So they could be working together for all intents and purposes.
Well, it's not that so much working together as they each have interests that they can serve. They have mutually. They attacked.
They attacked the Israelis. Took out the Osirak.
Yes.
Nuclear plant.
That's right.
In Iraq.
That's right, in 1982.
Yes.
And
if any other Arab country would want to try and toy with the idea
right.
of putting up a nuclear, even for peaceful purposes, you can rest assured that maybe the Israelis will send their own elite, state-of-the-art military air force, which is one of the best in the world, to go and take them out. They've never done that with the Iranians, and they would never do it.
But if you look at threats in this region, threats to us sitting here in Nairobi. We're coming up on the first anniversary of the Dusit Hotel attack, 14 Riverside Drive. And Al-Shabaab used as its justification after the fact that this was to retaliate against the United States recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now that seems very odd, but it also was in the playbook of Al-Qaeda. It was also a way of as a jihadist or a terrorist organization as Al-Shabaab is, striking out here, it gained them more credibility. It also brings in more money, more funding from Al-Qaeda. But as we come up on the first anniversary of that attack, we've since then seen the United States has recognized the Golan Heights as being part of Israel. Again, we also now have the killing of Suleimani, assassination. So in a sense, there are targets in and around Nairobi that can be activated very quickly. Attacks on shopping malls.
I was talking to a friend who told me, well, it's not as clear-cut as black and white as it looks like.
Well,
you never know.
Well, I don't know.
You see, the Americans and Iranians have always been silently talking to one another. And most likely Suleimani is one of those people who are very difficult in this kind of a negotiation, which would probably go all the way up to the highest order in
well, that's way above my pay grade.
So,
on the other hand, I would say...
So then probably the idea of taking him out is maybe it's something that would be discussed, and the truth will come out when both me and you are in the grave, because these things take 50 years, 60 years before they come out. But the reality of the matter is that they say he was such a powerful diehard that he had to be gotten out of the way for their real negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians to take hold, because I don't see Iran as being a threat to any American interest anywhere in the Gulf states. On the contrary, some of the other, what do you call, mainstream Sunni states are the ones who can be, in the long run, because doctrinally, when you look at the doctrine of the Shias and the doctrine of, it's a very liberal, very, it's not a very strict, regimented system. The Shia, you couldn't pray all the prayers together at one go. You could, you know what I mean? It's not so difficult. In some of the cases of the Shias, they pray more or less like you do now in a church yourself. They go in with their shoes. The Ismailis I'm talking about. So historically, the Christians and the Shias got along much better. And then the Jews, for that matter, like you just mentioned, that the Jews have got a powerful representation in Israel, and most of their properties they have it back.
Yes.
So there is a powerful Jewish community interest in Iran. So what the point I'm trying to say is that it's not as it looks like. You could have many ways of looking at these things.
On the other hand, I would say again,
so if Suleimani was the only stumbling block and he gets out of the way, you never know. They could proceed on. And have the kind of talks that the internet
from the point of view of international law and order of sorts that we do, whether we honor international law, whether we honor the rules of land warfare. In other words, when Trump was talking about destroying cultural areas, that is a violation of the laws of land warfare. Those are war crimes. Those are genuine war crimes. And as I've been asked in the past on other shows, on other interviews about torture, the use of torture.
But ostensibly, the Americans who are supposed to be very close to the Saudis did not listen to the Saudis on some of those things. They're willing to work with the Shias to basically unravel and undo all those Sunni dynasties that were there for a very long time. Formal or informal dynasties, you get my point.
Yes.
And that basically is, these are the kind of things that are very tricky and hard to understand. And I think we're just going through a phase in which we all don't know what's happening, but these things have a history.
Yes, and now we're 7 days into a new year and a new decade, and it's even more confusing than it has been for quite some time.
Tell me about the Kenyan scenario. We have BBI. Just take 2 minutes to tell us something about BBI. We are also going through a landmark period in which we'll have a change of guard. Uhuru has been there for 10 years. There's talk of changing the constitution to have a parliamentary system, and there's talk of even Uhuru coming back again as a prime minister. You see what I mean? And a lot of those things. In a nutshell, the economy is not doing that well. The economy
is tanking. The economy is doing miserably. The fact is that people of all sorts are strapped for cash. That if you look at, but also looking at BBI. From my perspective as somebody who's lived here since 1981, looking at the decade since the Reform Constitution essentially was promulgated, what I've seen, and looking back, it's amazing that I would say we just had a lost decade. We had two elections during that decade.
2013, 2017.
2017. We had post-election. We came out of post-election violence, but the decade. We introduced a new reform constitution, which is genuinely one of the more liberal, reformist, that hasn't been fully...
One of the best, they say, of course.
Best or not.
It needs a little bit
we can always argue about best or not, but it has not been... The thing is, it was not implemented. The Constitution in 2010 has not been fully implemented, not in its letter or spirit, and that includes legislation enacted since the 27th of August 2010. That includes the security force legislation.
To operationalize the new dispensation, yes, I agree
Well,
with you.
to operationalize the fact that the KDF now requires National Assembly prior authorization before it's acting within the borders of Kenya. What have we seen? The bus attack last Thursday, the KDF responded without any authorization from National Assembly. See, what we're hearing now is what's happening in the United States with the imperial presidency of Trump is where the congressional Democrats are trying to pass laws or to, in fact, repeal laws that were passed in the aftermath of 9/11 that authorizes all of these wars everywhere in the world. That is to restore congressional oversight over the operations of the military. That is how the executive uses the military. We're seeing exactly the same problem here. We have prohibitions on the Kenya Defense Forces operating internally, and if they do, it has to be authorized by the National Assembly, and I would suggest that...
we haven't seen it.
We haven't seen it at all. We didn't see it at Westgate, we didn't see it at Dusit, we're not seeing it anywhere.
In a sense, it's, I'm looking at it purely from, as somebody who would want to really take a scholarly look at how states work and how governments work. It's in my opinion, a president can commit can commit a country into a war. He can commit a country into, or she can commit a country into military operations using a small procedural thing, like we have the National Defense, National Security Committee in Kenya here, I think, where the president also sits on, and or the vice president sits on his behalf. When sometimes you have to take such a fast and rapid decision that you can do it, but then seek the approval later on. Otherwise, they cut off the funding. Americans had a similar system before. I don't know when they changed it, whereby the president could commit American forces into an adventurous, whatever, inside and outside the country. Remember when
Not inside.
No, both. Because I still remember when John F. Kennedy called on the National Guards to help in the busing and the desegregation.
They federalized the state guards.
Federal, yes.
That's a different story.
He gave that instruction of using the federal forces to enforce basically that piece of, and then of course go back to the Congress again and get that approval. And I think that happened under Lyndon, Ben Johnson, it happened under a number of them. So the idea that you can only go to war after you have gone back to your Congress and gotten an approval from the Congress, if there's a declaration of war, like the Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor happened, the American forces did not have to sit back to respond.
But you're referring to declarations of war externally. The Constitution of Kenya refers to acting for internal security, domestic insecurity. The KDF must be pre-authorized and must be under the command of the police. This is so what we saw at Dusit was, in fact, the GSU commander was in command of the scene.
He's still part of the police. The GSU is part of the police.
And that is considered civilian.
That problem, I think, only happened in Westgate, where
the Kenya Defense Forces told the police to leave.
Absolutely.
And the police left instead of taking out the Constitution.
That, in my opinion, was a height of ignorance on the part of the military.
Well, we still don't know what happened. But now we have a situation, Farah, again, since Sunday morning in Lamu, where we may find the KDF locking down all of Lamu without the police. I'm not saying that the Kenyan...
But that is, you see, listen, Andrew, I think sometimes you have to look at the practicability of these things. If you are attacked, the KDF is attacked.
Yes.
You can't tell them not to fight back and secure
I didn't say
the
that.
area before.
I have not said that at all.
Until you have what you call that authorization from the
No, nobody is saying that at all. Yes. Nobody is saying that at all. I'm saying that if you
I think that's an area where we can take another hour or 2 hours to discuss on this. We've come to the end.
Oh, I'm sorry then, because we're missing the point. We're missing the point that if a KDF armored personnel carrier, machine guns, a Pro Box, in Garissa, in town during the day and kills civilians, and that's after the Garissa University attack, we justify it on the fact that that area is under Al-Shabaab threat. Now, I think it's a slippery slope that we have to be very careful about.
I get you very well, but I can assure you, the line, the very thin line that separates the need to bring those assets in to protect national security, both from internal and external threats, is very tricky. But having said that, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Always a massive pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
To have you on this program, because you come with a lot of wealth of experience and wealth of knowledge, and you are able to be given your multidisciplinary background. I mean, you're a lawyer also, and you've studied law for all these years. You can put these things in a pretty much holistic format. Thank you very much. Until we get together the next time again.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Pleasure to have you. Viewers, we have come to the end of this show. And until we are together again, from us in Ebro TV at Speakers Gallery, have a good night. Thank you.